Was a king truly mad? Could a monarch descend into a chaotic whirlwind of delusions and rage, all while clinging to the vestiges of his former authority? And what happens when the line between sanity and madness blurs, leaving a legacy of shattered lives and a kingdom teetering on the brink of collapse? The year was 1788. London shimmered with the promise of revolution, whispers of liberty echoing through the cobblestone streets. But within the gilded cage of Windsor Castle, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to consume the very foundations of the British monarchy. King George III, the man who had stared down Napoleon and secured Britain's dominance on the seas, was unraveling. Not with a dramatic, theatrical collapse, but with a slow, insidious decay, a creeping madness that would redefine his reign and forever stain the annals of British history. It began, as these things often do, with a single, unsettling morning, August 1st to be precise. The palace pages, young lads accustomed to the rigid formality of court life, were roused from their slumber by a scene of utter pandemonium. Queen Charlotte, a woman renowned for her composure and grace, burst from her chambers in a state of frantic alarm, clad only in her shift, a scandalous display of vulnerability that sent ripples of unease through the royal household. She didn't wait for explanations, didn't offer apologies. She simply bolted, leaving a trail of bewildered servants and a palace buzzing with speculation. The initial diagnosis was vague, a collection of unsettling symptoms attributed to everything from gout to indigestion. Sir George Baker, the king's physician, offered a particularly perplexing theory. The king had walked on the grass several hours, and without having changed his stockings, which were very wet, went to St. James's, and that at night he ate 4 large pears for supper, having had no dinner. It was a diagnosis as baffling as it was absurd, a testament to the medical ignorance of the era. But as the days bled into weeks, the symptoms intensified, morphing from mere discomfort into something far more alarming. The king's stomach would seize with violent pain, leaving him hunched over in agony, his face contorted in a grimace of suffering. Cramps would ripple through his legs, accompanied by a bizarre rash that, according to his daughter Elizabeth, appeared as if it had been scourged with cords. But the physical symptoms were merely a prelude to the mental turmoil that was rapidly consuming him. His speech became erratic, a torrent of disjointed sentences and nonsensical pronouncements. He'd leap to his feet during sermons, throwing his arms around his family in a display of unsettling affection. He'd wander through concerts, ignoring the music, and launch into rambling conversations on a bewildering array of topics, from the merits of different types of cheese to the geopolitical implications of the Ottoman Empire. Fanny Burney, a member of Queen Charlotte's household, described the king's behavior with a mixture of horror and fascination. "How nervous I am," the queen exclaimed to Burney, her voice trembling with anxiety. "I'm quite a fool, don't you think so?" The queen's fear was palpable, a reflection of the growing dread that gripped the entire court. The once confident monarch was transforming before their eyes, descending into a state of unpredictable agitation. One particularly memorable incident occurred at chapel. Mid-sermon, George III abruptly rose from his seat, seized his wife and children, and launched into a passionate outburst. "You know what it is to be nervous," he declared, "but was you ever as bad as this?" The scene was chaotic, unsettling, and utterly bewildering. Sir George Baker, ever the meticulous observer, documented the king's increasingly bizarre behavior with a detached clinicality. He noted the king's tendency to rise and sit repeatedly during concerts, ignoring the music altogether. He recorded his incessant conversations, a relentless stream of pronouncements on everything and nothing. He even observed the king's strange habit of addressing dead people, issuing orders to those who had long since passed away. But the most disturbing aspect of the king's decline was his growing paranoia. He became convinced that London was flooded, ordering his yacht to be dispatched to the submerged city. He peered through a telescope, insisting that he could see his ancestral homeland of Hanover, despite the fact that it was located thousands of miles away. He composed elaborate letters to foreign courts, filled with fantastical tales and extravagant promises. As the king's condition deteriorated, so too did his awareness of his own madness. "I am sorry for it," he lamented to Francis Willis, the new physician appointed to his case. "You have quitted a profession I have always loved, and you have embraced one I most heartily detest." The king's disdain for Willis was evident, a reflection of his growing resentment towards the doctors who were attempting to treat him. Francis Willis, a clergyman turned physician, adopted a brutal approach to treating the king's madness. He believed that the king's illness was caused by bad humors that needed to be purged from his system. He subjected George III to a series of increasingly bizarre and painful treatments, including blistering his shaved head, attaching leeches to his body, and administering strong emetics. One particularly harrowing episode involved Willis confining the king in a straitjacket, forcing him to remain motionless for hours on end. The king, understandably enraged, lashed out at Willis, screaming obscenities and threatening to expose his past as a clergyman. Willis, unfazed, simply tightened the straps of the jacket, further restricting the king's movements. The king's confinement in the coronation chair, as he sarcastically dubbed it, became a symbol of his suffering and his humiliation. He was strapped into the chair, gagged, and forced to endure Willis's lectures on the impropriety of his lewd ranting about a certain lady of the court. Despite the relentless barrage of treatments, the king's condition continued to worsen. His speech became even more erratic, his delusions more vivid, his behavior more unpredictable. He began to address the servants with unfamiliar titles, referring to them as "Your Majesties." He demanded to be dressed in elaborate costumes and carried around on a velvet cushion. The queen, witnessing her husband's descent into madness, grew increasingly fearful and distraught. "How nervous I am," she exclaimed to Fanny Burney, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm quite a fool, don't you think so?" The queen's anxiety was understandable, given the terrifying spectacle of her husband's unraveling. One night, in a scene that would forever be etched in the memories of those present, King George III burst into the queen's bedroom, seizing his son, Prince George, by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The outburst was a terrifying display of rage and disorientation, a stark reminder of the man he once was and the man he had become. The king's decline culminated in a dramatic confrontation with his heir, Prince George. "I am sorry for it," George said with mounting agitation. "You have quitted a profession I have always loved, and you have embraced one I most heartily detest." The king's disdain for Willis was evident, a reflection of his growing resentment towards the doctors who were attempting to treat him. As the king's condition worsened, so too did his awareness of his own madness. "They would make me believe I have the gouts," he cried, kicking one foot against the other. "But if it was gout, how could I kick the part without any pain?" In despair, the king sobbed on the shoulder of his favorite son, the Duke of York. "I wish to God I may die," he cried, "for I am going to be mad." The court physicians, baffled by the king's symptoms, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. Dr. Richard Warren, in a particularly misguided attempt to cure the king, ordered that his shaved head be blistered to draw out the bad humors from his brain. Leeches were attached to his forehead, and he was subjected to a series of violent purges and emetics. But despite the relentless efforts of the physicians, the king's madness continued to progress. His speech became even more erratic, his delusions more vivid, his behavior more unpredictable. He began to address the servants with unfamiliar titles, referring to them as "Your Majesties." He demanded to be dressed in elaborate costumes and carried around on a velvet cushion. The queen, witnessing her husband's descent into madness, grew increasingly fearful and distraught. "How nervous I am," she exclaimed to Fanny Burney, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm quite a fool, don't you think so?" The queen's anxiety was understandable, given the terrifying spectacle of her husband's unraveling. Ultimately, it was Francis Willis's brutal methods that brought about the king's final collapse. The king, exhausted and humiliated by Willis's relentless treatment, succumbed to a violent seizure. He was confined to the coronation chair, strapped down, gagged, and left to endure Willis's lectures until he finally lost consciousness. the king's reign of madness was over. But the legacy of his illness would continue to haunt the British monarchy for decades to come. What drove the king to madness? Was it a genetic predisposition, as some suggested? Was it the result of a traumatic childhood experience? Or was it simply the product of a fragile mind pushed to the breaking point by the pressures of the crown? The question remains unanswered, a tantalizing enigma that has captivated historians and medical experts for centuries. The prevailing theory today is that King George III suffered from a particularly virulent form of porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can cause a wide range of neurological and psychiatric symptoms. Porphyria can lead to hallucinations, delusions, seizures, and even coma. But even with the benefit of modern medical knowledge, the mystery of the king's madness remains partially unsolved. There were many factors that may have contributed to his decline, including his stress, his grief, and his dependence on alcohol. The king's illness had a profound impact on his family. His wife, Queen Charlotte, was devastated by his condition and struggled to cope with the demands of caring for a mentally ill husband. His children, particularly his son, Prince George, were deeply affected by his erratic behavior. The king's reign of madness is a cautionary tale about the fragility of the human mind and the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness. It is a reminder that even the most powerful and influential individuals are not immune to the ravages of disease. But it's also a story of resilience, of love, and of the enduring strength of the British monarchy. Despite the challenges he faced, King George III remained a symbol of stability and strength for his people. And his family, particularly his wife and children, provided him with unwavering support throughout his illness. The king's madness ultimately led to the accession of his son, Prince George, to the throne. The young prince inherited the throne at a time of great political and social upheaval, facing challenges that would test his leadership skills to the limit. And the legacy of King George III's madness continued to resonate throughout British history. His illness served as a reminder of the importance of mental health and the need for compassion and understanding for those who suffer from mental illness. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the king's madness is the question it raises about the nature of sanity and madness. Is madness simply a deviation from the norm, a sign of weakness or instability? Or is it a different way of perceiving the world, a different way of experiencing reality? The story of King George III's madness is a complex and multifaceted one, a story that continues to fascinate and intrigue us today. It is a story that reminds us that even the most powerful and influential individuals are not immune to the mysteries of the human mind. And as we reflect on the king's tragic fate, we are left with a profound sense of empathy and understanding for those who struggle with mental illness. For in the end, we are all vulnerable to the ravages of disease, and we all deserve compassion and support. But one final, unsettling question lingers. Could a king truly be sane, or was the very notion of sanity itself a construct, a fragile illusion in the face of the vast and unknowable mysteries of the human mind?